I'm really struggling to try and figure out what exactly Nigel Farage's plan is here. What is his end goal? Because at the moment, it seems like things are very much up in the air, and Reform are on an inflection point. They're on a knife edge. Things could go one way or the other, and the polls seem to reflect that. So, as you can see, from about a week ago, they were down to 23% in the polls, but a poll that came out today, which was done a couple of days ago, shows Reform at 28%. Now, each individual poll isn't actually worth that much. On the average of polls, Reform have been around 25 to 26 for quite a while now, and this seems to be something of a cap. This poll is definitely an outlier, but as Stats for Lefties here point out, if this were to be reflective, you would see quite a gain for Reform. So it could be, in fact, this would be enough for Reform to form a government. So it could be that, in fact, Reform may be able to do something, but if that's the case, well, what do they intend to do? Because when Rupert Lowe said, look, if people, and I think this is the thing that Farage really took umbrage with, the people who are part of the grooming gangs should be deported. I don't think that's terribly controversial, but then Rupert Lowe went a bit further and said, and anyone who knew that they were doing this, as in anyone who was complicit by direct knowledge of the events and said nothing, well, they should also be deported because they are complicit in the crimes. And I don't find this to be an unreasonable position at all. Why would we want people here who are complicit and happy to be silent in the face of industrialized gang rape and pimping of teenage English girls? Why would we want that? That's crazy. And so Nigel Farage and Reform appear to have fabricated a bunch of allegations against Rupert Lowe. The ones from the young lady seem to have gone nowhere. They produced the KC's report, which was the King's Counsel. It's a lawyer that's given to them by Parliament. And this report was released early. And the lawyer said, well, hang on a second. It wasn't ready. I hadn't actually spoken to Rupert Lowe and taken his side of things in the report, which is why the report itself was so unfair. And so Rupert Lowe had another independent review done by another King's Counsel, and they found that, frankly, the investigation Reform had done into Rupert Lowe, which, frankly, I find highly dubious at best, was, of course, highly dubious. Lack of improper setup, improper handling of compliant evidence. Rupert has a very long statement here, and as you can see, procedural unfairness, questions of independence, no right to reply. Rupert's got a very long statement here, and I find it to be very reasonable. I'll let you go and read it in your own time. But the point being is that Rupert obviously wasn't the problem with Reform, right? Rupert was obviously not someone who was causing trouble or acting in ways that are untoward. He was, in fact, doing the real dog work of the party. He was putting in the written notes in Parliament. He was fundraising when he found out he was kicked out of the party, etc., etc. He was well loved by his constituents. He seemed, if anything, like I covered in previous videos, like a threat to Nigel Farage. Okay, fine. Kick him out if you want, but reporting him to the police under the allegation, and this is what the Reform UK spokesman has said, Mr. Lowe is being investigated by the police for making multiple threats to kill our chairman, and so Rupert Lowe has had his gun collection seized by the police. Now, this is obviously bonkers, right? Because, I mean, Rupert Lowe's account of this, so Zia Yusuf's account is Rupert Lowe threatened to cut my throat. Rupert Lowe's account of this is that he said to Zia Yusuf that Zia Yusuf was cutting the throat of the party. Well, he said. But the point being is, I don't really think that's actually a terribly serious threat. I think that Rupert Lowe was probably being metaphorical, probably is the case. At best, I think we could say that Zia Yusuf has misinterpreted what he said. I don't know if English is Zia's first language or anything, so who knows. But the point being, this is kind of preposterous, and no one, I think, really thinks that Rupert Lowe is going to go and shoot Zia Yusuf, right? I think that's so obviously off the table. Rupert Lowe, 67-year-old businessman who Nigel Farage asked to join for the Brexit Party and then as a Reform MP. I don't think that this is reasonable. I think this is absolutely ridiculous. And I think that there's probably going to be no evidence either way, and nothing is going to come of all of this. And so why make up this story? Because remember, they've made up previous stories about Rupert that seem to have evaporated into nothing. This is the last thing, and really, Zia, he's threatening to what? Murder you? Shoot you? Are you crazy? No one thinks that's the case. But anyway, moving on. There are theories like this going around from Wolf, who's doing superb work on all of this. You should probably follow him on Twitter, who says, I keep trying to tell you that Nigel Farage and Zia Youssef are not trying to win. They don't want to go above 30% of the polls. That's not the point of reform for them. And then he links this story. Now, this story is very interesting because you may remember that Nigel Farage has been heavily vetting his candidates.
And those numbers, no wrong ones in there, often get caught out by...
All I can promise you is that
they've been fully vetted.
We have vetted our candidates to a higher level and a higher standard than any party has ever done before for local elections.
Well, apparently one of their candidates who slipped through the net, who looks like a guy who's very sane, was posting tweets in support of Jimmy Savile, and that somehow slipped through the net. Interesting that that's the case, especially as he was able to get through, claiming that Jimmy Savile was a working class hero when he was actually one of Britain's most notorious paedophiles. This finally got this guy suspended, I suppose. But I can't help but notice that reform was so much more prickly when it came to people that I personally know. For example, Dan and Bo at Lotus Eaters were both... Reform made a call for people to run for candidates, and they volunteered. And Dan and Bo both cited things from the Reform manifesto, such as illegal immigrants will be deported, and they got deselected by it, for it, because of Hope Not Hate, because of the Scottish Echo or something, put Bo on their cover because Bo made a joke about Scotland, and this just instantly dropped. But somehow this guy gets through, so it's like, right, that's a very interesting vetting process that you have. But anyway, so one thing that popped up, and I find this very interesting, is Nigel Farage giving an interview with GB News.
Talk to the White House, are they using you as a back channel? We thought that might happen when he came in, and right now would be quite helpful.
What's really interesting is that in the first term, I spoke to the White House quite a lot. In this term, I haven't, because I can't be seen to interfere unless the government wants me to be useful or to be helpful. I have said many times, I don't just know the president, I know half the cabinet.
But I don't think that's why Trump doesn't give Nigel Farage the time of day anymore, because you may remember that when Nigel Farage, when the Clacton and the early polling for Reform coming up to the election was coming out, and it was looking like Reform was doing quite well, then when they're only on like 15-16%, Nigel Farage says, no, I'm going to go to America to help Donald Trump, because it was before the election in America. And for some reason, that fell through. There's nothing came of it. And Farage wasn't invited to Trump's inauguration, even though he did go and he didn't meet with Trump. And now he seems to be making excuses as to why he's not getting close to Trump. Because, I mean, like, we've just had a 10% tariff put on us by the United States. Not that we actually export much. Apparently, it means it's going to be difficult for Games Workshop sales in America.
Trump's tariffs could be worse for Britain than you think, and I can prove it with these. Imagine you're a British company, hypothetically making something like this from Warhammer. All your production's here in the UK, plus a decent chunk of your customers. But you also sell a lot to the US. In fact, they're your biggest market. Thanks to Donald Trump's new tariffs, the companies you sell to in America will have to pay the US government 10% every time they buy one of these figurines. If that's passed on to consumers as higher prices, you could lose some of these American customers.
Why would Nigel Farage not be able to leverage his friendship with Trump? Well, apparently he just wants to remain distant to him, which honestly feels like what has happened here is Donald Trump has seen through Nigel Farage. He's marginalised him. He's pushed him outside of the sort of sphere of grace. He doesn't want Nigel Farage close to him. And that's an interesting thing. Now, frankly, this may actually be a good thing for Nigel Farage because Trump putting tariffs on us and various other things that Trump does, that the British media just constantly hammer him for, probably actually would reflect badly on Nigel Farage in Britain at this point. So Farage has kind of lucked into success here by somehow failing to maintain his friendship with Donald Trump. But anyway, so the thing that I really want to talk about here, all of this is just kind of things that have happened with Reform and the way they've completely mistreated Rupert Lowe, in my opinion. But the thing that I really want to talk about is Nigel Farage saying, well, look, we're in a societal economic, social and cultural decline, and it needs to be turned around, otherwise the country will be literally unrecognisable. And that's interesting because Nigel has specifically said that he will not encourage or entertain the concept of mass deportations. He doesn't seem to be very bothered about the changing demographics of the country. He seems to be more concerned about the institutional integrity of the country, which is a very boomer perspective on things, but actually not terribly useful. I mean, if the institutions survive, but the British people, the native British people don't, well, who cares? I'd rather sacrifice the institutions rather than my family and community and country. But Nigel Farage doesn't seem to be very bothered about that. And so he has apparently plans for a revolution of some sort.
The reason I came back out of political retirement last year, partly frustration that Brexit wasn't being delivered anything like I thought it should be, but chiefly because I genuinely believe that we are in a cycle of economic decline, of societal decline, of cultural decline, which if it's not turned around in the space of a few short years, this country will literally be unrecognisable to all of us.
So you can imagine yourself going to the door number 10.
So let me finish. I see myself right at the moment to be the right person to lead a completely new political movement, if you like, a political revolution. And I believe right now I am the best person to do that. If somebody younger and better looking comes along who's more capable than me, do you know what? I'll recognise it.
But the question is, well, what kind of revolution would it be? Because Nigel is always very light on details. He's always been very light on policy. And frankly, do we believe that he would actually do anything terribly substantive? Like, what do we think Nigel Farage's plan to revolutionise the country is, other than a recommitment to the institutions of the 20th century and some reheated Thatcherism? I mean, he never says, and there's no particular reason that we should think that he has a detailed plan about this, or really the will to carry it out. Because, again, as Wolf points out, well, Nigel Farage has been in bad health for quite a long time. This is back from 2015, where he points out that actually he's been smoking and drinking for quite some time. He's been an alcoholic at points in his life. His health probably isn't brilliant. And so the energy to carry out a full-scale revolution for a man who is, 62 now, I think it is, and in not such great health, well, I mean, does he have the energy and willpower to even do this? And that's something that people, I think, are picking up on. Lots of people I've seen saying something like this. And the issue that I think really is just tickling at the back of people's minds is, well, you remember when Zia Yusuf bought his way to the top of the party? Well, Nigel Farage made some really strange comments that the BBC reported. During the election campaign, Mr. Farage suggested Mr. Yusuf could one day lead the party. Huh. That's interesting. And so, Zia Yusuf has made the allegations against Rupert Lowe, who Nigel Farage accused of trying to take over Reform. Now remember, that's not possible because Reform is owned by a company that is now run by Zia Yusuf and Nigel Farage. So if something were to happen to Nigel Farage because of his health, then Zia Yusuf would be left in sole possession of Reform. Of course, it's not actually a party, it's a company, and it has no internal democratic mechanisms, so he would just inherit this party from Nigel, were Nigel to have a bout of ill health or something like this. And Nigel has already kind of seeded this idea in people's minds. So the purportedly right-wing party that has the intention of winning the next election and reforming the country in some way would be led by a Muslim man who just bought his way in. And you can imagine how that's gone down with many people. Actually, this wasn't really what we were signing up for, the based right-wing party that was going to fix the country. This wasn't what people were expecting. And I think a lot of people are actually becoming sour. But, like I said at the beginning, Reform are doing very well in the polls, so perhaps this is all just speculative and I'm completely wrong about all of this. I really don't know. But I don't like the way that the party's been operating. I don't like the way that they've treated Rupert Lowe. I think this is just preposterous. I suspect, I mean, Rupert Lowe doesn't have a criminal record, obviously. I suspect that in 6 months' time or something, all of this will have disappeared, and the police will say, no, there's nothing to any of these allegations. This was enough for them to just try and shove Rupert Lowe under the bus, like Farage has done with dozens of other people during his political career. I mean, you'll notice that now he's only got like 9 allies. Who are his allies? Well, like, oh, we've got 1,600 candidates for the May elections. It's like, yeah, okay, but who are they? They're just going to be people who you've just recruited, put through your wonderful vetting mechanism, and the second they become inconvenient, you're just going to throw them under the bus. And then eventually, when all is said and done, you're going to leave Zia Yusuf in charge of your party and maybe the Prime Minister. Nigel Farage will have delivered the first Muslim Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, which again, I just have to say, I don't really think was what people were signing up for.